Right then, good evening, and welcome back. It's not been too long since I recorded the last episode, so not that much to say for this bit, other than to thank the patrons once again, and to get stuck straight in. So when we left off last time, we had just finished the forms for this word that was going to mean house. And it has not escaped my notice that this form, de casa, does have that casa sequence that is awfully similar to the Spanish casa, which also means house. I'm not too put off by that in this instance, because that similarity is a result of inflection rather than the actual form of the root itself. So I think that, in and of itself, is fine. However, what I'm not fine with is just how heavy this form is. Like, this is the accusative singular, which is possibly going to be the most commonly used form. And this assa ending, it's 2 syllables with a geminate. It just feels too big and too clunky to be the most commonly used ending of the paradigm. And that's also the case with some of the other forms we have down here, like ostisso. The more I think about it, just the more I think it needs shortening up in some way. So the question is, how do we do that? My immediate thought is that geminate S gets reduced just through phonological reduction and frequency of use to a single S, which would therefore make it liable to undergo word final vowel loss, which would give us de cas. Now, doing that would mean that the nominative, accusative, and locative singular, as well as the accusative plural, would be identical. And that's not necessarily the end of the world, but I might just play around with this a bit and see if I can get something different. So these are what the original forms would have been, but the singulative ending only gets added on after that AI sequence has become a diphthong, unless we just say that one of them usurps the other and we only have a single vowel there. Attaching the singulative does shift the stress back, but it would have already been on the I anyway, so that doesn't matter. We can very easily justify the unstressed U as disappearing, and those 2 sibilants will just blend together into a geminate. Then we say the geminate is lost, and then the final vowel is also lost, and then that I diphthong would be susceptible to the rule about diphthongs turning to monophthongs before codas. So that I would become A, and it would still have stress on it in this case, so then that would later change to E. It occurs to me that in the rules that we have, monophthongization before codas happens before word final vowel loss, which means that in the modern language we're still going to have final syllables that have diphthongs followed by coda consonants. I don't like that so much, so maybe I'll throw in a rule here that gets rid of diphthongs again. That feels a little bit like a cop-out. They could reduce in different ways this time, I guess. I mean, monophthongization happens all the time. So, yeah, maybe. The only way I can think of to get this one to be different from this one is to say that since the stress is on the A, the diphthong reduced to a monophthong earlier on in history, so that would give us a difference in vowel quality there. Or actually, maybe the opposite would happen, because in the accusative we have the diphthong before a geminate. And so because we do effectively have a coda consonant there, maybe the diphthong would be more likely to be reduced. So we'd get a difference in vowel quality then. The locative singular would be the same as the nominative singular, and I can't imagine how the accusative plural would possibly reduce any differently than the nominative singular. So that's our tentative pattern. It's better than it was. While I'm at it, I think I'm going to reduce that long E in the dative to just a short E, because it's occurring before a geminate. Now, in the case of this word for tree, that would have been the original form, and if we apply the same logic to it, then we'd get a geminate forming, and then the I diphthong would just become a long monophthong, and then rounding harmony would turn it into a long O. And in that case, then it would be the same as the nominative and the locative. because no matter how it reduced, rounding harmony would always turn that vowel into a long O. Okay, I think that's fine. I mean, syncretism in these sorts of case systems is extremely common anyway. And for this form that means rock, we could justify doing the same thing of ditching that geminate and just reducing it to a form that's identical to the nominative and the locative. In fact, I think it would only make sense to do that if it's happening with the other forms. And I don't know why I had these dative forms like that, because the R and the S would definitely come into contact with each other before that point and turn into a geminate R. That's what we'd actually expect. I'm also kind of tempted to say that since this word for house or building is going to be pretty common, that K gets skipped over, and then we can reduce these to single syllables. For now, we'll just add that to the ever-growing pile of things to think about later. In the meantime, let's get back to some of these verbs. First of all, I realized I made an error with this verb that we're tentatively saying means to go. I forgot that in the first principal part we'd get umlaut, so that A would ultimately raise to an I, and then the Y would just assimilate into the I, so it would be itin, which does look suspiciously similar to the Latin word ire, which also means to go. Not a huge fan of that, but we can work with it. Also, the more I've thought about it, the more I think I actually don't like having this form mean to see, the one that we're also using for the evidential. I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that some other verb could come along to take over the meaning of to see. And I am once again mindful of the fact that the most common words tend to be the shortest. Now, a lot of the forms here are polysyllabic. Even in the proto-lang, some of them were 3 or 4 syllables long. So that, I think, makes them less likely to be used for basic meanings. But the word that's becoming the new word for to see did not mean to see in the proto-lang, because that was this monosyllabic root here that now means to know or to understand. So this word might have had an original meaning of something related to seeing, like to watch or to look at, something that gradually just weakened in sense. I think I quite like this form, oh boy, yilha. It is trisyllabic, but I think that's believable for something that started out with a more specific meaning of watch or look at or observe. Thinking about it some more, I'm starting to think that this iata form is too long for a basic meaning of to go. And in this case, we know it must have meant something like to go in the proto-lang because it's giving rise to these postpositions. I like yat as a postposition. I think I might change the meaning for this one. So what immediately springs to mind is to change it to enter, which gives a pretty obvious postpositional meaning of into, which means that this away from meaning would no longer make any sense, because to enter from something. So we need a new word for to go then, and specifically a word that meant to go in the proto-lang, so we can get a word for toward. Because new words for to go can crop up quite a lot, like quite famously in the Romance languages. The word for to go in different Romance languages derives from, I think it's like 4 or 5 different Latin words, and there's different patterns of suppletion for which ones are used in which circumstances. I can't remember now, but it's like some of them use the old word for to advance, or to walk, or to run, or things like that. So it's entirely possible that the verb that gave rise to the preposition that means toward will have been completely replaced by the time in the modern language then, which gives us a little bit more freedom. Although again, the original word for go may still survive in verb compounds, might be used to derive like verbs of motion and things like that. Maybe something just like ba, and then we can do the same thing as we did before, where when it's in the accusative, it'll have the meaning of from. But regardless of whether that sticks around in any shape or form, I would still like there to be a new word for to go. I quite like this one, but at the same time I do want to save that vt for a postposition, and we can't have another postposition derived from another word that means go. I'm also looking at this one. That one's nice and short, but in fact it's so short I think I'm going to save it, because we can justify the new word for go coming from an older, more complex root with a more specific meaning. In fact, I think I'm going to go ahead and make this one the word for to come, or to arrive, because that's another really basic, really simple root, and it's another candidate for possibly being wrapped up in verb compounds for verbs of motion. So having it be a single syllable like that will help in that regard. And I think I'm going to use this duma form for the word that means to go. And I think to run is a decent enough meaning for it to have in the proto-lang. Even in English, run can have a more general sense of just movement or going. I really want to get a meaning for this postposition, and I really want this verb to be a common verb because I like the sound of it. If we made this verb mean something like to live, or to dwell, or I guess to reside, then the wird postposition could mean in, or within, or inside. I imagine both of those will see pretty common usage. And then for this vak form here, I did have an idea for a postpositional derivational pathway a while ago, is if we had a verb that meant to ride, or to mount as well, I quite like the idea that that gives rise to a word that means on, or on top of, or maybe even above, actually. Or over, I guess, as well. Man, English has a lot of words for the concept of being on top of something else. But you can see that. If you're riding something, then you are on top of it, pretty much by definition. And it would make sense for this culture because they have a long history of agriculture and domestication and animal husbandry, and so they would have had mounted animals in the time of the proto-lang. So yeah, I think that's quite fun. So that's already a lot of our postpositional bases covered, but while we're vaguely on the subject, some of the other words I'd like to get nailed down are the verbs that are being used for these comparative constructions. Now, granted, these aren't going to be especially useful to us until we actually have some adjectives. Don't worry, we will get there eventually. But I would still, while we're at it, like to get some phonological forms down for these different verbs. So for the basic comparative, we need to defeat or overcome. And it occurs to me that, as I had it written here, we would use the converb form of this verb. So for this example, like, the cat is bigger than the dog. The cat is big while defeating the dog. We could definitely do that, and that does make sense. But if this construction is old enough, if it predates the reification of the converbs and the principal parts, we could just say that defeat just is a plain old preposition. So it would just be like, the cat is big, defeat the dog. So it would essentially just be a postposition that just means than. I'll come back to that in a second when we start thinking about actual forms for it. But in the meantime, to defeat is also used for the superlative. The equative and contrastive both used to reach. And again, that could be a converb, or it could just be a straight-up postposition. And then for the excessive, we use to fear. Now, in that case, it makes more sense to me that the converb would be used. Because in this case, it's not being used in any sort of postpositional way, it's just purely being used as an adverb. So, like, if you wanted to say, the house is too big, that would be, the house is fearfully big. So in that case, it couldn't be a postposition, it would have to be a converb. I'm actually leaning towards the postpositional route. So defeat would give us a postposition that means than, and the postpositional form of reach would be something like up to, or until. Like Manchu does that. In Manchu, the word for until is just the converb form of to reach. Actually, random idea, we could say that one of the converbs of to reach gives us an adverb that means enough. So like if you wanted to say, I've seen enough, you could say, I have seen reachingly, or I have seen in the manner of reaching. Like I have reached the point where I no longer need to see. That's kind of cool. Oh, also, another random idea. I remember seeing this in some paper ages ago. Can't remember what the language was, but I remember seeing a language where the word for exceed or surpass was the word for to reach with an intensive on it. So like overreach, in a sense. Now we don't have intensives yet, but we will get around to that relatively soon, hopefully. I'll just make a note of that here. Now, none of these verbs are especially common, so we can use slightly longer forms here if we need to, although the postpositions should probably be comparatively short. I'm thinking of using qëtin for to reach, which would make the word for until qëret. And while I'm at it, I think this word for to reach could also have a sense of to arrive, or I guess to arrive at. And that only makes sense, because you can say something like, we reached the city, to mean we arrived at the city. We already have our word for to come up here, which can also be used to mean arrive, but that's more than permissible to have two different words that can be used to mean to arrive. Now for this word that means enough, which principal part should we use? The first principal part is the imperfective converb, so it's like, I have seen while reaching. The second one is the purposive converb, so like, I see in order to reach. And the third one is the perfective, so I see having reached. I wonder if that would require an antipassive, because it is a transitive verb. I think we can get away with dropping the object here. At one point it may have been required to state an object, but once the construction forms, I think we can get away with just dropping the object. And I think the third principal part does make the most sense, because it's like the reaching has already been achieved. You have reached the point where it is now enough. Since this word for to fear is necessarily going to be in converb form, that means it can't be that long. Ideally 2 syllables maximum. So I want both of these to be short and simple. This baca form, if it were to become a postposition, then that would just be by, which is good. I like how short it is, but we've just said that the word for toward is ba, and I want it to be more distinct than that. Maybe we could use bayan for to fear instead, so in which case the way you formed an excessive construction would be that you would put bayan before whatever the adjective is. Just make a separate entry for that as well. And in this case, I'm pretty certain that the first principal part will be the one to use, like, the house is fearfully big, as opposed to, the house is big in order to be afraid, or the house is big having been afraid. No, it's gotta be the first one. I do quite like this kamba form, but I'm not sure I like using another uvular initial word when we're already using one for the other comparatives. What I might do is just take the uvular off. We're just left with amba. I like that MB cluster. Yeah, let's go with that. Okay, very good. We've now got all of our comparatives done. Also, another idea I had that I'm not going to explore just yet, but I was thinking that for a word for unless, we could use a word that means to fail in the converb, because you could see how a pathway like that would work. Like in English, you can say something like, I'll see if there's anything interesting on TV, failing that, I'll go to sleep. If you sort of rephrase that to something like, failing something interesting being on the TV, I'll go to sleep, which you could very easily reinterpret as, unless there's something interesting on TV, I'll go to sleep. So I think that idea makes sense, but I'm not going to get into it now because that would involve a discussion of conditionals and other subjunctive-y stuff. I'm going to put it there as a note and come back to it. Also, another thing before I forget. At some point within the last few months, I heard someone use the expression, I'm hungry for such and such. Now, I don't know how common that construction is. It's definitely not part of my idiolect. But it gave me an idea for an interesting derivational pathway. If we had a verb that meant to hunger, or to be hungry, then with our applicatives, you could transitivize that to make the direct object the source of hunger. So you could end up with a word like to crave, or with a little metaphorical extension, to desire. Like, you could easily see a meaning of to hunger weakening to just mean to want. And in fact, thinking about it now, we already have a word for to lack, or to be empty, and that very often ends up becoming a word that means to want. So maybe in this language, the way that transition ends up happening is with an applicative. I think the applicative that would make the most sense here would be the directional. Just, I lack seeing a sandwich, or I lack in the direction of or concerning sandwiches, means I don't have a sandwich. So then we add the il prefix, and I'm pretty certain that doesn't actually change the pattern of sound changes at all. And voila, we have a word for to want. Cool, that was easy. That can be the standard word for to want, and this one can be slightly more poetic in sense. So to hunger is not an especially common verb, so it can be a bit longer, but again, to generate this form we need to attach an applicative to it, which is another syllable. I think maybe this barda form could be nice. It's the right sort of length. Adding the applicative won't change the sound changes in any way, and with the il prefix, I do like that LB cluster. And there we go. Very nice. Now we're really picking up speed. Okay, and the last verbs I think I'm going to do for now are for the reflexive and the reciprocal. So you'll recall that we have this detransitive prefix that is simultaneously a mediopassive, an antipassive, and a reflexive. But I think there'll probably be a clarifying strategy for when you're actually using it as a true reflexive, and that will be distinguished from the reciprocal, where I can't remember if I actually said this idea out loud at any point, but the idea I had was that the reciprocal was marked with a converb form of a verb that means to oppose. So like, they saw each other would be, they saw themselves opposingly. I think that makes sense. So we could have a verb that means to oppose, or just to be opposite, or to be against, and that could very easily give rise to a postposition that means against or opposite. I think I like this simitin form, which for the postposition would be sinta. I think, again, that the first principal part would make the most sense here. You carry out the action while opposing each other. So whenever you have a reciprocal construction, you just add simitin. Now for the reflexive, could that be accomplished with a converb construction as well? Maybe it's just my European language-speaking mind, but the thing that immediately leaps out to me as a possibility is to use a specific reflexive pronoun. But could there be a verb that means to do something to yourself? I'm actually coming up on time here, so I'm actually going to go away and think about that off air. But before we finish up, now that we've generated a whole bunch of new verbs, let's finish things up with a noun. So what noun are we going to do today? We did an inanimate last time, and I still need to think about how exactly to handle the singular forms. So we're going to do either a human or an animate. So, a very long time ago now, I proposed a conceptual metaphor for this language that weather events are animals. I think that's how I phrased it. This being the case then, if we had a word for storm, then that would more than likely go along quite well in the animate class. So what's a good word for storm? I'm thinking something like kayad. Okay, we'll go with that for now. Okay, starting out with the singulars. All of those are pretty straightforward. In the nominative dual, the only effect of adding the dual ending is just lengthening the vowel, and therefore preventing it from being lopped off once word final vowel loss happens. That's interesting. We've got some interesting umlaut happening in the plurals. So the plural of kayad is kayodis. We've got a couple of minor points of departure from this other animate, which is good. There's definitely an overall pattern that's consistent across most of these forms, but with just subtle variations going on, which is exactly what we're aiming for. And now that that's done, let's top things off with an example sentence. And this time round we have a glut of verbs to choose from. In fact, we've got so many verbs, I'm tempted to actually do a multi-clausal sentence. Oh, wait a minute. I've just realized we've got a word for to ride, and the word that we've just made is storm. That's too perfect to not use. So I'm thinking there's going to be a converb clause riding the storm, or while riding the storm, toward the house, the bird, because it makes sense for a bird to be riding a storm, or actually the two birds, just to give us an excuse to use the dual, the two birds arrive at the child's tree. And I think in this case, it would probably just be the sort of default to use alienable possession, but I think at least metaphorically, if the child has grown the tree, has put in the effort of cultivating this tree, then that could be seen as an accomplishment, the tree that the child made. So we could use the possessive classifier for accomplishments here. What tense are we going to use? We haven't done a future perfect in a while. The two birds will have arrived at the child's tree. Okay, so the first bit, riding the storm toward the house, is a converb clause. In fact, maybe it would make sense for the first bit to be having ridden the storm. If the birds have already arrived, then they will have already ridden the storm. Sure, that makes sense. So the first bit can just be handled by a converb clause. So we need the verb for to ride. And then having ridden is the perfective form, which is the third principal part. So it's varak. And since it's a converb clause, it doesn't need an auxiliary to go with it. We don't need a finite verb here. So it would just be varak. Then we need storm in the accusative, which is kayadas. Then we need toward the house. So toward is ba, and the noun needs to be in the locative. House in the locative is dekis, so that's the converb clause done, but the subject of the converb clause is the same as the subject of the main clause, which is the two birds. So birds in the nominative dual is mihinni. Not 100% sure what to do about the positioning here, because the converb clause will be free to be moved around. I don't know if the subject would precede it or not in this instance. I'm going to put the subject first. Okay, now we come to will have arrived. So we could either use this word that means to come, and then, since that's intransitive, the noun would need to be in the locative. Or we can use this form that means to reach, and that one is transitive, so the noun can just be in the accusative. You know, why not both? Let's try both versions and see how they work. In either case, for the future perfect, we need the third principal part. So that's nas and korot. And then the auxiliary to pair with that would be form 3, and it would be animate singular, because the dual triggers singular agreement. And then we need the child's tree. So if we are using a possessive classifier, it needs to be in the nominative. So we go with nilwa. The possessive classifier for accomplishments, and then for the nas form, it's intransitive, so we need tree in the locative. And in this case, since it's a prepositional phrase, it would go before the auxiliary, because there is no direct object. Whereas in the second one, the child's tree is the direct object, and it would therefore come immediately before the lexical verb. And it would instead be in the accusative case, but that doesn't matter because basically all of the singular cases are identical. So depending on which one you happen to feel like saying, you could say either Mihunnu dekis ba kayadas varak nilwa vanam ostos onnas, or Mihunnu dekis ba kayadas varak on nilwa vanam ostos korot. And those would functionally mean the same thing. Blimey, right. That was quite a productive session, I feel. We're starting to generate words a lot faster now, and that will, I suspect, continue to snowball, so that hopefully this will be the year where I finally get to do Lexember. So next time I'm going to endeavour to finally figure out once and for all what to do about the causatives. I'm still ruminating on how exactly I want to handle that. And also, don't think I've forgotten that this language still needs a name. I am working on that and still thinking about forms that I like for that. We'll get to that soon enough. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.